The wind whispered through the torn landscape like a living thing, carrying with it the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smoke of 1,000 fires. Captain Elias Rowe rode at the head of his squad, his boots sinking into mud that squelched with every step. The trench they had been ordered to secure was rumored to be cursed, but rumors were luxuries soldiers could not afford to heed, not when survival depended on steel, fire, and luck. "Keep your eyes open," Elias muttered, his voice rough and low, more to himself than to the men behind him. His squad followed, tense, rifles cradled against their chests. Private Silas Kane, young and wide-eyed, tried to appear steady, but his hands shook as he adjusted his helmet. The battlefield was a nightmare frozen in time. Craters gaped like open wounds in the earth, some filled with stagnant water that reflected the dusky sky like dark mirrors. Corpses littered the mud, some barely recognizable, half buried, their faces twisted in final moments of terror. A chill crawled down Elias's spine. He had seen death before, in every possible form, but this place, it was different. It felt alive. As they neared the trench, faint whispers drifted across the battlefield. At first, Elias thought it was the wind, carrying fragments of old conversations. But the whispers were too deliberate, too human. Words he could almost make out danced on the edge of hearing. Names, taunts, cries for help. "Did you hear that?" Kane whispered, voice trembling. Elias did not answer. He felt it in his bones, the sense that they were being watched, and not just by enemy eyes. Something waited beneath the mud, beneath the blood-soaked soil. Night was falling. The sun had vanished behind thick clouds that swirled like smoke, leaving a gray haze that swallowed the horizon. The squad finally reached the trench. It was deep and narrow, the walls slick with mud, water pooling at the bottom. Broken rifles and shattered helmets littered the floor, remnants of soldiers long dead. Captain Elias motioned for the men to take positions. "Keep your eyes sharp, don't touch the dead, and for God's sake, keep your mouths shut." The first watches were long and uneventful. The wind carried distant artillery booms, but otherwise the night seemed quiet. Then a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The mud quivered, almost breathing. Kane froze, eyes widening in terror, as a skeletal hand burst through the soil beside him, clawing frantically at the air before sinking back into the earth. "Move! Move!" Elias shouted, grabbing Kane by the arm and pulling him back. The rest of the squad stumbled to positions as the trench walls shivered, mud cracking like brittle bone. No, it's just the ground," Kane stammered, but his voice sounded hollow to his own ears, swallowed by a whispering chorus that had begun to rise from below. Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard stories of battlefields haunted by the restless dead, of soldiers who never returned, their bodies claimed by the earth. But this was something more. The voices beneath the soil were calling to them, names, cries, threats, and laughter all mingling into a maddening symphony. One by one, soldiers began to see them, fleeting shadows among the mud, figures of men they had once known, some friends, some enemies, emerging from the dirt only to vanish when approached. Each apparition brought a sudden rush of cold, as if the grave itself exhaled a frigid breath. "Stay together," Elias barked, though his voice lacked conviction. He felt the tug of the earth beneath him, subtle at first, like fingers brushing his boots. Then came the scream, a sound so raw, so desperate, it clawed at his mind. Private Lorne, the youngest of the squad, had been pulled down by the trench wall, or what he thought was the wall. Mud erupted around him, and a dozen skeletal hands shot up, grasping, dragging him screaming into the earth. The men fired their rifles, but bullets seemed to pass through the hands, sinking uselessly into mud that moved with unnatural life. Elias rushed to the edge, trying to grab Lorne, but the boy's scream ended abruptly as the soil closed over him, leaving only a mound of mud as if he had never existed. "God," Kane whispered, stepping back against the trench wall, shaking uncontrollably. It's alive." "Yes," Elias admitted under his breath, feeling a cold sweat crawl down his spine. "It's alive." Hours stretched like a waking nightmare. Every movement seemed amplified. A twig snapping sounded like an explosion, a falling helmet like a bomb. And through it all, the whispers continued, some pleading, some accusing, some laughing. By midnight, the trench had become a prison. The ground shifted beneath their feet, the wall seemed to close in, and the soldiers' eyes began to deceive them. Elias saw Lorne staring back at him across the trench, but when he blinked, it was gone. He saw men he had killed in earlier battles, eyes burning, faces twisted in rage. Kane turned to him, voice cracking. "Captain, what do we do? We can't fight this." Elias shook his head. "We survive, that's all we can do." But even as he said it, a hollow feeling gnawed at him. He knew the battlefield would not let them leave. Not alive. Suddenly, a violent tremor ran through the trench, knocking men to the mud. The whispers exploded into voices, distinct and horrifying. They called Elias by name, not his rank, not his title, his name. And then one voice, clear and insistent, shouted, "You failed him! You left him to die!" Elias froze, every instinct screaming. The voice was that of a soldier he had tried to save months before, a boy whose death still haunted him. The mud around his boots bubbled, and he saw fingers reaching up, grasping, pulling him. "Fall back!" he shouted, trying to drag his men with him, but the trench had become a labyrinth of shifting soil and screaming hands. Another soldier was pulled down. Another. The earth seemed endless, consuming the dead and the living alike. Elias realized with dawning horror that the rumors were true. The trench, the battlefield, it was alive, hungry for the blood and fear of men, and now it had them. The night stretched on, an endless cacophony of whispers, screams, and mud that moved as if it breathed. Elias crouched, rifle clutched to his chest, eyes darting across the trench walls that seemed to close in with each second. The whispers intensified, repeating over and over, "Stay, stay with us, forever." He did not answer. He only gripped his rifle tighter, praying to a God he did not believe in, as the soil around him began to writhe like living veins, promising that in this war no one could escape. And then, from beneath the blood-soaked mud, a single skeletal hand shot up, grasping at him. The trench had become a living nightmare. The night pressed down like a suffocating shroud, and the whispers from beneath the blood-soaked soil grew louder, more urgent. Captain Elias Rowe's hands shook slightly as he tried to steady his rifle, though he knew it would not protect him. Bullets were useless here. The earth itself was the enemy. Private Silas Kane crouched beside him, trembling, mud streaked across his face. "Captain, there—" He stopped, staring at the trench wall. Shadows slithered across the mud like smoke. Shapes of soldiers, friends long dead, emerged, faces twisted in anger, eyes hollow yet burning with an unnatural light. Each apparition seemed real enough to touch, yet vanished whenever Kane reached toward it. Elias's stomach churned. "It's not real. It can't be real. Focus on the living, Kane. Focus on surviving." But even as he spoke, a familiar voice whispered in his ear, soft, accusing, yet clear. "You left him. You left him to die." Elias froze. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Harper, a soldier who had perished months ago during a failed offensive. The memory of Harper's death had haunted Elias, but hearing the voice now, distinct and alive, made him falter. Mud shifted beneath his boots, writhing as though the soil itself was stretching toward him. The squad attempted to regroup, their nerves frayed. Corporal Briggs muttered prayers under his breath, though none of the men were particularly religious. It made no difference. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking, cruel, endless. Suddenly, a shrill scream pierced the night. Private Lorne had ventured too close to a mound of mud that bubbled like boiling blood. Hands erupted, skeletal and gnarled, clawing through the soil, dragging him into the earth. His scream was cut off abruptly, replaced by the whispers of the trench itself. "Another joins us, another, another." Elias fired his rifle wildly, but the bullet struck nothing. The earth itself was solid, yet moving, alive with a hunger that could not be killed. Kane grabbed Elias's arm. "We need to move. We need to get out of here." Elias shook his head. "There is no out. Not tonight. Not here. This trench, it's alive. It's feeding." The horror escalated. Each man began to see visions tailored to their fears and guilt. Kane saw his younger brother, a boy he had failed to protect in a previous battle, reaching out from the mud, screaming for help. Corporal Briggs saw his wife staring through the trench wall, calling his name, only for her face to twist into the grotesque mask of a corpse. The trench itself seemed to shift and twist, narrow passages elongating impossibly, mud walls closing in. Every sound was amplified, the drip of water, the squeal of leather boots, the cracking of mud. The soldiers' minds began to fray under the pressure, each whisper worming its way into their memories, dredging up every fear, every regret. Kane screamed as his hand was grasped by a skeletal limb emerging from the mud. He pulled desperately, but the earth's grip was unyielding, forcing him to his knees. Elias lunged, ripping at the hand, managing to free him for a moment, but the ground beneath Lorne had claimed him fully, leaving no trace that he had ever existed. "Stop!" Elias shouted. "We have to stick together. Don't let it isolate you." But isolation was inevitable. The battlefield seemed to conspire against them, separating men with invisible walls. Private Dernan stumbled into a side trench, shouting as he disappeared into a mound of writhing soil. His cries echoed briefly before dissolving into the whispers. The surviving men looked on helplessly, realizing that the ground did not care about loyalty, courage, or rank. It only consumed. Elias's mind raced. He remembered old legends soldiers whispered about, battlefields haunted by the restless dead, soil that held the rage of every fallen soul. But those were stories meant to scare children. He now knew they were warnings. Every death, every scream, every ounce of blood spilled on this cursed land added to its power. By now, hallucinations were indistinguishable from reality. Elias saw Harper standing in the trench, pointing directly at him. "You failed him. You failed all of us," the apparition said, voice cold and merciless. Elias fired at Harper, but his bullets passed through. The figure merely smiled, merging with dozens of other soldiers' faces, all accusing, all blaming. Kane stumbled beside him, clutching his head. I can't tell what's real." "No one can," Elias said grimly. He realized that sanity itself was a weapon the earth used against them, eroding their minds while it clawed at their bodies. Then a low rumble shook the trench, more violent than anything before. Mud erupted violently as dozens of skeletal hands clawed upward, reaching, grasping, and dragging at anything in reach. Corporal Briggs was pulled under, leaving only his helmet behind, spinning in the mud like a grotesque crown. The whispers became a chorus, chanting, laughing, weeping, voices overlapping, merging, overwhelming. Elias grabbed Kane and shoved him toward a collapsed wall, hoping to find cover. But the trench had changed. Paths that existed minutes ago were gone, replaced with walls of mud and roots that twisted like living veins. The earth itself was a maze, a trap with no exit. Breathing heavily, Elias scanned the trench. Every soldier not yet claimed was paralyzed with fear. Kane's eyes were wide, reflecting every flicker of shadow, every whisper that brushed against their consciousness. Then came the voice again, distinct, terrifyingly familiar. Elias froze. "You will join us." It was Harper again. Elias realized that every voice, every whisper, every hallucination was a lure designed to drag them into the soil. They were not merely fighting for survival. They were fighting against their own minds, against a battlefield that fed on fear, guilt, and blood. Kane stumbled, tripping over a corpse partially buried in the mud. Elias grabbed him, pulling him back, but as he did, he felt the earth beneath him shift violently, like a living heartbeat. The ground opened slightly, revealing rows of skeletal hands, writhing like worms, reaching for him. "No!" Kane screamed, clawing at Elias. "No! Don't let it take us!" Elias's grip tightened. He knew that sheer force would not save them. Only awareness, cunning, and perhaps luck could. They had to survive the night, somehow. Above them, the clouds shifted, revealing faint moonlight that did little to illuminate the trench. The whispers subsided momentarily, as if the soil were drawing a deep, hungry breath. But Elias knew the lull was temporary. The battlefield would awaken again, hungrier than before, and the night was far from over. He looked at Kane, determination hardening his faces. "We survive, together. Stay close, don't let it separate us." Kane nodded shakily, still clutching his rifle, eyes darting to every shadow, every ripple in the mud. The trench shivered again, as if sensing our defiance, and from beneath the blood-soaked soil, another skeletal hand erupted, followed by another and another. Elias fired his rifle wildly, but the bullets swallowed the earth, leaving only the whispering chorus behind. "Stay, stay, forever." And as the night deepened, the voices beneath the blood soil grew louder, merging into a single, horrifying promise. The war was not over, and neither was their fate. The trench had become unrecognizable. Mud walls twisted unnaturally, narrowing and widening at impossible angles. Elias Rowe moved cautiously, rifle clutched, every step sinking into the living soil. Behind him, Kane's breathing came in short, ragged gasps, echoing in the suffocating darkness. Each sound they made seemed amplified, swallowed by the whispering chorus that rose from the blood-soaked earth. "We can't stay here," Kane whispered, voice trembling. It's watching us. The ground, it wants us." Elias nodded, though his hands shook. He had already seen what the soil was capable of. Hands had dragged their comrades into the earth, their screams cut short, leaving no trace. The battlefield was alive, feeding on fear, guilt, and blood. But survival required action, not despair. "Then we move," Elias said grimly. "We find solid ground, somewhere." Hours passed as they stumbled through the twisted trenches. Every step brought hallucinations, flickering shadows of soldiers long dead, whispers of those they had failed, visions of impossible horrors that vanished the moment they focused on them. Kane saw his younger brother, the boy he had promised to protect, buried beneath a mound of mud, calling out his name. Elias saw Harper again, standing silently at the edge of the trench, eyes burning, accusing him for failures long past. The landscape shifted beneath their feet, and before long they discovered a ruined bunker, partially hidden by collapsed walls and mud-streaked debris. The air smelled of rot and decay, stronger here than anywhere else. Elias motioned for Kane to follow. "Inside," he said. "Maybe it's safer." Inside, the bunker was a tomb of horrors. Blood streaked the walls, some of it moving, as if alive, pulsating in time with an unseen heartbeat. The remnants of previous occupants littered the floor, corpses half buried, journals scattered, and strange symbols etched in dark, dried blood. The flickering moonlight from cracks above illuminated the scene, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe. Kane shivered. What is this place?" Elias picked up a tattered journal. The pages were filled with the handwriting of soldiers who had once tried to survive here. Each entry described the same nightmare, whispers from beneath the soil, hallucinations that drove men mad, hands dragging soldiers into the mud. The final entries were almost illegible, scrawled in panic. "The soil remembers. The voices never sleep. Once you enter, you cannot leave. The dead do not rest." Elias swallowed hard. He had suspected something supernatural, but the evidence was undeniable. This battlefield was cursed, a living entity that consumed everything. And it wasn't limited to corpses. It preyed on the living, exploiting fear and guilt to trap them eternally. As they read, a tremor ran through the bunker floor. Elias's instinct screamed. He swung his rifle toward the source of the movement. Mud erupted through cracks in the walls, skeletal hands clawing upward, grasping for them. Kane screamed and tried to retreat, but the bunker seemed to twist, hallways stretching impossibly, doors leading back to where they had already been. The earth itself had turned the structure into a trap. "Hold together," Elias shouted. "Don't let it separate us." But it was too late. From beneath the mud, Kane was pulled downward by invisible forces, hands clawing through him like living knives. Elias lunged, grabbing Kane's arm, pulling with all his strength. For a moment, he thought he had saved him. Then Kane's eyes widened in terror as a skeletal arm erupted fully from the mud, grasping him by the chest and dragging him down. His screams echoed off the bunker walls, merging with the whispers until they became indistinguishable. Elias fought desperately, but Cain disappeared beneath the soil. Only a swirl of mud and the haunting chorus remained. Elias staggered back, panting, hard hammering. The whispers had grown louder, now chanting, a chorus of every soldier lost on this battlefield. The words were clear and malicious. "Another joins us. Another. Another." Elias's stomach turned. He realized then that the whispers weren't merely echoes. They were alive, aware, feeding off each soul, each regret. The battlefield, the soil, the very earth had become a predator. He pressed forward, deeper into the bunker, desperate for answers, or at least a way out. The walls were lined with more journals and strange symbols etched into the stone. Many entries spoke of the same horrifying truth. The battlefield consumed not just bodies, but minds. Soldiers lost their sanity before the earth claimed them. Guilt, fear, regret, these were the hooks that pulled men under until they were trapped forever in the soil, their voices joining the chorus to lure new victims. Elias's mind reeled. He had thought war was the ultimate horror, but this was beyond human comprehension. The battlefield had no allegiance, no morality. It existed to feed. A sudden noise, a whisper, a laugh made him freeze. The air grew colder, heavier. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, shadows shifting unnaturally, forming figures that resembled men he had commanded, soldiers from past campaigns. Their faces were twisted in rage, eyes burning red. They were alive in some unnatural way, and yet dead. "You," one hissed, voice like dry leaves. "You left us." Elias fired, bullets scattering uselessly into their forms. They dissipated, merging into the shadows, leaving only a residue of cold and malice. He realized the battlefield did not simply kill, it tormented, using memories and guilt as weapons. Then a terrible thought struck him. He was alone. Cain was gone. Lauren was gone. Briggs and Durnan were gone. The earth had claimed them all. And the whispers, the chorus were growing louder, calling his name, mocking his attempts to survive. Elias stumbled to the far end of the bunker, finding a narrow tunnel partially blocked by debris. Mud dripped from the ceiling, slick and foul. He knew the soil would follow, but he had no choice. Crawling forward, he felt the ground vibrate beneath him, as if sensing his movements. Hands reached through cracks, grasping at his legs, pulling him backward. He kicked and twisted, managing to wriggle free, but the effort left him gasping, bruised and covered in mud and blood. At the tunnel's exit, moonlight illuminated a horrifying sight. The battlefield had become a shifting nightmare. Trenches looped impossibly, craters opened and closed, and skeletal hands reached from every mound of soil, dragging unseen victims into the earth. The whispers were deafening now, merging into a single voice that seemed to echo from the soil itself. "Join us. Stay forever." Elias sank to his knees, chest heaving. The reality was unavoidable. The battlefield had no escape. Every step forward risked death. Every hesitation risked being claimed. And the soil beneath his feet, it waited, hungry, patient, eternal. He looked back toward the bunker, half expecting to see Cain, alive, looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. But the entrance was empty, silent, except for the distant, echoing chorus. The bunker had become a tomb, and the soldiers it consumed were now part of its eternal hunger. Elias rose slowly, hands shaking, rifle gripped tightly. He had survived so far, but he knew this was only the beginning. The earth had tasted blood, and it would not rest until it had claimed every soul it could reach. The whispers followed him as he moved forward, the chorus of voices beneath the blood soil growing louder with every step. And somewhere, deep beneath the mud and ruin, the battlefield itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, ready for the next victim to stumble into its endless, living horror.
Elias Rowe's boots sank into the blood-soaked soil with every step. The trench network behind him had twisted into something unrecognizable, walls closing and stretching impossibly. The battlefield pulsed like a living thing, feeding on every fear, every heartbeat. He knew now there was no escape, not from the earth, not from the whispers, not from the curse that had claimed his comrades. The moon cast a pale light over the cratered landscape, revealing a scene more nightmarish than anything Elias had imagined. Trenches twisted like serpents, some ending abruptly in walls of mud, others opening into gaping chasms where skeletal hands rose, grasping and clawing for the living. Corpses, some barely recognizable, rose in staggering formations, their eyes glowing faintly red. They moved with unnatural coordination, marching across the battlefield, whispering orders in voices that echoed like the screams of the dead. Elias swallowed hard. Every soldier he had ever commanded, every enemy he had ever faced, every life he had touched in this endless war, it was all here, trapped beneath the blood soil. The whispers were now deafening, chanting his name in 1,000 variations, accusing, pleading, mocking. Stay, join us forever. He stumbled forward, desperate for solid ground, for any semblance of escape, but the battlefield mocked him. Each trench he entered seemed to loop back on itself, the craters stretching impossibly, the earth folding like the pages of a grotesque, living book. Mud erupted around him, skeletal hands clawing, dragging invisible victims into the soil. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the ground itself shifted to block his path. Elias's mind raced. Every hallucination he had suffered, the visions of Cain, of Lorne, of Harper, were part of the battlefield's design. It did not merely consume the body, it consumed the mind, using fear, guilt, and memory to weaken its prey. He felt the earth beneath him pulse, a heartbeat synchronized with his own, echoing through his bones. And then he saw it, a freshly dug grave, impossibly deep, with a skeletal hand emerging, reaching toward him. He froze. The voice of the battlefield, deep and resonant, whispered, "Your turn, your time, join us." Elias aimed his rifle and fired, but the bullet struck nothing. The hand continued to rise, the soil itself writhing, pulsating, alive. Panic surged through him, but there was no time to think. The trench walls shifted again, narrowing, forcing him forward toward the grave. Desperation lent him speed. He ran, stumbling over mud, corpses, and debris, but the battlefield resisted. Craters opened beneath his feet, skeletal hands grasped at his legs, whispering threats and promises of death. Every scream he had ever heard, every voice of a soldier he had lost, echoed around him. They were all here, part of the chorus that would never rest. Elias realized the truth. The battlefield was infinite. No soldier had ever left it alive. Every attempt to flee, every path forward or backward was part of the trap. The soil itself was a predator, patient, eternal, feeding on the blood, fear, and guilt of those foolish enough to enter. His vision blurred with sweat and tears. He remembered Cain's terrified face, Lorne's final scream, Harper's accusing eyes. Every memory now had a physical weight, a tug at his very soul, pulling him toward the waiting earth. And then the whispering changed. It was no longer chaotic. It was clear, deliberate, a single voice rising above the chorus. "Join us, Elias, or die." He stumbled to a halt, heart hammering, and saw the horror fully for the first time. Across the battlefield, hundreds, no thousands of skeletal hands clawed from the ground, some dragging shadowy, tormented figures into the soil. The air shimmered with hallucinations, soldiers he had fought beside, soldiers he had killed, all merged into a single mass of accusation and rage. Elias's rifle slipped from his grasp. He was too late. The earth beneath him shifted violently. A mass of mud and hands erupted upward. He tried to run, but the soil grabbed at him, gripping his boots, pulling him down inch by inch. He clawed at the mud, but it was unyielding. The whispers became a deafening roar, a chorus of the dead and dying, promising eternal suffering. "Stay, stay, stay." Elias fell to his knees, digging at the mud with his hands, desperate to free himself. Every ounce of strength he had was useless against the living soil. He realized with terrifying clarity that the battlefield had been feeding for years, centuries perhaps. Every war fought here had added to its power, every life lost, a new voice in its chorus. And now it had him. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of rage and terror, but the earth swallowed it, merging it with the chorus of the damned. Fingers of mud and bone wrapped around his arms, dragging him down, pulling him into the blood-soaked soil. As he descended, visions flashed before his eyes, Cain reaching for him, screaming, Lorne's final scream, Harper's accusing stare. Every memory now had a physical weight, a tug at his very soul, pulling him toward the waiting earth. And then the whispering changed. It was no longer chaotic. It was clear, deliberate, a single voice rising above the chorus. "Join us, Elias, or die." He stumbled to a halt, heart hammering, and saw the horror fully for the first time. Across the battlefield, hundreds, no thousands of skeletal hands clawed from the ground, some dragging shadowy, tormented figures into the soil. The air shimmered with hallucinations, soldiers he had fought beside, soldiers he had killed, all merged into a single mass of accusation and rage. Elias's rifle slipped from his grasp. He was too late. The earth beneath him shifted violently, a mass of mud and hands erupting upward. He tried to run, but the soil grabbed at him, gripping his boots, pulling him down inch by inch. He clawed at the mud, but it was unyielding. The whispers became a deafening roar, a chorus of the dead and dying, promising eternal suffering. "Stay, stay, stay." Elias fell to his knees, digging at the mud with his hands, desperate to free himself. Every ounce of strength he had was useless against the living soil. He realized with terrifying clarity that the battlefield had been feeding for years, centuries perhaps. Every war fought here had added to its power, every life lost, a new voice in its chorus. And now it had him. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of rage and terror, but the earth swallowed it, merging it with the chorus of the damned. Fingers of mud and bone wrapped around his arms, dragging him down, pulling him into the blood-soaked soil. As he descended, visions flashed before his eyes, Cain reaching for him, screaming, Lorne's final scream, Hopper's accusing stare. Every memory now had a physical weight, a tug at his very soul, pulling him toward the waiting earth. And then the whispering changed. It was no longer chaotic. It was clear, deliberate, a single voice rising above the chorus. Join us, Elias, or die. He stumbled to a halt, heart hammering, and saw the horror fully for the first time. Across the battlefield, hundreds, no thousands of skeletal hands clawed from the ground, some dragging shadowy, tormented figures into the soil. The air shimmered with hallucinations, soldiers he had fought beside, soldiers he had killed, all merged into a single mass of accusation and rage. Elias's rifle slipped from his grasp. He was too late. The earth beneath him shifted violently, a mass of mud and hands erupting upward. He tried to run, but the soil grabbed at him, gripping his boots, pulling him down inch by inch. He clawed at the mud, but it was unyielding. The whispers became a deafening roar.